My name is Matthew Kane, and this is the Dirty Air F1 podcast.
We ride on board with Lewis Hamilton, but let's see how much he's going to be staring and how much he's going to be gaining down the main straight here. The gap was 0.8 of a second at the end of the last lap. It's half a second as they cross the line now. Hamilton's got DRS. He's within touching distance of his teammate. He's ahead of his teammate. Lewis Hamilton goes round the outside of Valtteri Bottas. And wow, what another good move that was from the world champion.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to this episode of the Dirty Air F1 podcast. I'm your host, Matthew Kane. Thank you so much for joining me today. Before we get to the race recap and qualifying of the 2021 Portuguese Grand Prix, there's a few things that I wanted to discuss first. A reminder to all those who are looking to get into my F1 merchandise contest, you still have until tonight to both follow me on YouTube and Instagram, as well as on Twitter, and then retweet at least 2 of my podcasts to your followers. That's all you have to do to qualify, and the winners one person will be able to win a shirt from the team of their choice. Another winner will be able to win a hat from the team of their choice. Another winner will be able to win an accessory like a keychain or a coffee mug or perhaps a tote bag. Once again, I'm self-funded, so I'm still trying to offer out things to people who are supporting the podcast for sure. And until I get a sponsor or until I feel confident enough that I should approach the teams themselves for some merchandise for all of you, this is the way it's going to be for now, but at least there's something in it for you. So once again, thank you for following me on all those platforms. It's fantastic. And I really enjoy interacting with each of you, especially the private messages, and we share F1 stories or racing stories back and forth. I think it's really great. So this has been an amazing journey so far, and I'm really enjoying it. So let's keep on going. This week, unfortunately, we heard the inevitable news that the Canadian Grand Prix has once again been cancelled due to the COVID pandemic in Canada right now. Congratulations to Turkey. I know they'll host a fantastic event. As myself living here in Canada and have been to 25 Grand Prix in my life, it's awfully strange not going. And it really hits home to how all of our lives have changed, etc. So again, I'm sure that Turkey will host the event fantastically, and we'll just have to cheer extra hard for the Canadian boys in that race. But unfortunately, no go for Montreal this year. On the positive side, apparently they have signed a 2-year extension with Formula One to continue the Grand Prix being in Canada. So that's good news going forward. Let's just hope that the pandemic gets handled here and we get back to Circuit Villeneuve and enjoy ourselves for the Canadian Grand Prix once again. I originally had planned to toy with the format of this week's podcast. I was going to put out a shorter episode after qualifying with sort of my observations of qualifying and then also race predictions. Not only would I be able to look back and see how well I did with predictions, but also hopefully engage the listener as well and share their predictions, and then we could have little contests to see how people are doing, etc. But you know what? I was unaware of the sort of the respect being shown on social media this weekend, with people just not being on social media and for all that it stood for. And I had not been aware of that up until just a few days beforehand. So I decided not to go with the format. It made no sense to be posting all weekend and trying to market it, and it just wasn't the right thing to do. So I will try and do that for this week. We do have a short week here with Spain just right around the corner, but let's keep the same format for this podcast, where I discuss not only who qualified where and how they did in the race, and then my observations. First off, I thought it was fantastic going back to Portimao. I mean, what a circuit. This is such a wonderful circuit. Can you imagine? My brother and I were sitting there after the race thinking to ourselves, if you had a chance to drive a Formula One car for an entire day, what are the circuits that you would love to do it on? This circuit is fantastic. I would love to drive around this circuit. I wouldn't like to drive around it with no grip, though. And I certainly understand Max Verstappen's comments after the weekend. He said, I just don't want ever to come back here again because there's just no grip. And unfortunately, I bet because of the pandemic, there's been a lot of support races throughout the year that have not been able to run there. And that surface is yet to sort of wear itself in a bit. It's a classic circuit, and I just hope it returns for sure on a permanent basis on the calendar. It was certainly no surprise to see some of the cars struggling with grip, especially when the gusty conditions on Saturday during qualifying. Having said all that, I love the circuit, and I loved the race. I loved what it presented and how it showed who clearly is the creme de la creme on the grid, in my opinion. So, without further ado, let's get at it. Going into the race, I certainly expected the cars with the higher rake to struggle. And I'll tell you why. This circuit doesn't have a lot of high-speed bends in it. It has long straightaways, and then it has a lot of sort of low to medium speed corners. And this is where the Mercedes is actually stronger than the Red Bull right now. Not to mention the fact that the wind direction played a key role, especially in qualifying. I know Max went faster and he had his lap deleted, but we'll get to that. The winds were coming from about 11 o'clock if you were driving down the main straightaway going down into turn 1. So essentially it's a headwind. The higher rate cars were going to be suffering from higher drag. No question they would be suffering with top speed during those straightaways. Not to mention the fact that if the Mercedes were behind them with DRS, you've got no chance. Like Max said, he felt like a sitting duck. I felt the circuit itself was definitely going to favor Mercedes. And when you look back at last year, I know guys were going for fastest laps at the end of the race, but Hamilton did beat third place by 29 seconds. And that's exactly how much I thought he'd win by this year. And guess what? That's exactly what he did. I'm going to levitate now, everyone. Ready? Here I go. No. I am officially the Formula One guru. Back to reality. I'm just a guy in lockdown, spending too much time looking at a computer and talking into a microphone to myself. Qualifying in 20th place, F1's favorite rookie, Nakita Mazepin. Wow. He had a great weekend. It's amazing I said in the beginning, right, the fairest comparison would be to compare him to Mick because they're driving the same car, which we know is so far off the pace. If anything, it would be easier to drive because you're driving slower. The problem is you're young and you're trying to prove something, so you're driving faster. But as we saw right from the get-go, Mazepin, he can't even say a factual statement without people jumping on his back when he stated that Mick Schumacher had an advantage over him right now because of his attachment with Ferrari. You know what? That's factual because Mick got to go out and test at Fiorano. So every second that he gets to spend in a Formula One car is a benefit to him. So the statement is actually correct. But Mazepin has quickly become the guy that everyone doesn't like. And he did nothing to help that reputation this weekend. Congrats to him, though. He did get his first point. It was a penalty point for blocking Sergio Perez when he was leading the race. He also interfered with Latifi during qualifying, I believe. Although he said that he hasn't seen those guys and certainly didn't do it intentionally, it's quickly becoming a situation where I don't know how he's going to be able to thrive. Now, that's easy for me to say, right? I've never been in his shoes. I've certainly never been a billionaire's son. I wouldn't know what that's like. I don't know what his life experiences are. But right now, his attitude is rubbing people the wrong way, especially when you compare him to Mick. Mick is going about everything the right way. Mazepin's performance, he was half a second off of Mick most of practice, most of the qualifying, and he was complaining about his neck. And this to me is somebody who has suffered a pretty severe neck injury in a car accident myself. This is all about fitness. Nakita, you want to go half a second faster and start driving as fast as Mick? Well, guess what? Get in shape. You're in better shape than I am, but you're not in F1 shape. And Mick obviously showed up prepared. So that's another strike against him right away. And then, like I said, you blocked the leader in a race? Are you kidding me? Ridiculous performance by Nakita Mazepin, and I'm not even going to rate him. It's a big fat 0. I don't even know what else to say. As an F1 fan, it's an embarrassment that he's on the grid. I'm glad that Haas is still able to stay there. Obviously, I'm glad for the sponsorship money, but you know what? If I was an F1 driver, would I want him on the grid? No thanks. Luckily for him, Kimi was daydreaming at the start of the race and crashed out, or else he would have finished last. And in my books, he was still last. Qualifying in 19th was Mick Schumacher. As I already mentioned, Mick did get to spend some time with Ferrari just before the race and did some testing at Fiorano. No doubt, access to a Formula One car, regardless of its generation, is a help to this young man. And I can tell you that he just continues to go about things the right way, doesn't he? Has anybody said an ill word towards Mick Schumacher? I don't think so. He just continues to impress. He outperformed Mazepin all through practice, all through qualifying, and all through the race. And actually, it was neat to see that Mick was actually mixing it up with Nicholas Latifi there for a bit, and actually managed to finish ahead of him. So good on Mick Schumacher. He finishes 17th. He beats Latifi, Mazepin, and Raikkonen. This kid star just keeps continuing to rise, so good for him. Mick, well done. Very good weekend. I rate it as an 8 out of 10. Qualifying in 18th position was Nicholas Latifi. Latifi is somebody that, last race I just thought he gained so much momentum. It was such a boost for him, a much-needed boost, as he was managing to close the gap a little bit to George. And this weekend, everything went backwards. From the get-go, he said he didn't understand the car. It didn't feel right. He had no confidence. Didn't help that he was blocked by Mazepin. And that's the big controversy of the weekend between those two was, did Mazepin do it on purpose, considering how Latifi came back onto the track in Imola in those terrible conditions early on in the race? Didn't even notice that Mazepin was even there and managed to make contact with him. So Nicholas was the first one to jump out and say that he thought it was intentional. And in my mind, maybe Nicholas should have just left that one be, considering what happened back at Imola. That was his fault. And this one, Nakita said that he didn't do it on purpose. So he was fighting the car from the get-go, but he managed to find some pace early on. But you know what? It's the same kind of pace that Valtteri Bottas found. And I'll explain later why Valtteri managed to find pace those first 15 laps or so, and then he just fell away from it, and Lewis walked away with this thing. But overall, disappointing weekend for Nicholas for sure. Qualifying 18th, finishing 18th. Hated the car from the get-go. Possibly lost a little bit of confidence as well. Even George Russell compared the performance of the car on Sunday to the 2019 Williams. It was a struggle from the get-go. Having watched the sport for as long as I've watched it, there's nothing worse than being in a Formula One car that doesn't do what you think it should do, or doesn't do what you want it to do, especially at the speeds these guys are going. So, difficult weekend for Nicholas. I will rate his performance as a 4.5 out of 10. Qualifying in 17th position was Lance Stroll. Big disappointment. I know that he ran into some traffic in qualifying, and that's potentially why he didn't get through Q1, but the Aston Martin on the whole is really a disappointment this year. What a tough thing to watch. Lance apparently had some updated components on the car that Sebastian Vettel said were worth potentially half a second, and it didn't really show up this weekend, did it? Kudos to Lance, though. He just kept his head down and looked forward to race day and managed to move from 17th all the way up to 14th. He was actually in 13th position, but just before the end of the race, he gave way to Sebastian because Sebastian had let him go by earlier on without a fuss, because they did think that car was going to be faster, especially considering it had the updates. Overall, a disappointing weekend for both Aston Martin drivers, for the team, and I would rate Lance Stroll's performance as a 6 out of 10. Qualifying in 16th position was Daniel Ricciardo. Wow. When I saw that, I was honestly anticipating that we would hear that there was some unknown damage to the car that they would discover just before the race. But that wasn't the case. Who knows? Maybe he got a little bit unlucky. Maybe he caught a gust somewhere. You know, considering how Lando's performing in that car right now, Daniel is, he's a little lost, isn't he? He's a little lost. If anybody can come back from that, I honestly believe it's Ricciardo. I have such high regard for him. But considering that Lando was up in 7th, qualifying in 16th is not where you want to be, especially on this circuit with low grip. Passing was going to be difficult. But then again, we're talking about the Honey Badger. Daniel had a fantastic Sunday, obviously coming to grips a little bit with the car, but also extracting a little bit of that pace as well because the McLaren's quick. We saw Daniel get all the way back up to 9th place. It's a huge boost for him, huge boost for the team. It might have been a touch better had it not been for some pit stop issues. One time Daniel went a little bit deep in the box. But other than that, positive day for him, especially a good bounce back day after Saturday. So I would rate Daniel Ricciardo's performance as 7.5 out of 10. Qualifying in 15th position was Kimi Raikkonen. Sort of reminiscent of last year, isn't it? When Kimi qualified 16th, and then we all remember that fantastic first lap where he got all the way up to 6th. Overall, I would say the Alfa Romeo didn't really show exciting pace during practice and during qualifying. In fact, during practice, they had given Giovinazzi's seat over to their test driver, Callum Ilott. And Kimi managed to only go half a second faster than a kid who had never been in a Formula One car before. So he obviously didn't like the car. But you know what? Kimi's wise. He's got a lot of years of experience. He knew that he could potentially make up some ground during race day, especially with the low grip track surface. I mean, anything can happen, right? Unfortunately for Kimi, he did not have the same sort of start that he had last year and was suffering with brake issues during the warm-up lap going back to the grid. Once the race started, he'd actually tucked himself in a little bit behind Giovinazzi and didn't expect to get such a draft from him. And there's only Kimi, right? At 260 kilometers an hour, he's looking at his steering wheel. Imagine going that fast and trying to text somebody. You're not going to see what you're doing. Unfortunately, Kimi was fiddling with the brake settings, trying to get that situation under control and wasn't watching where he was going and plowed into the back of Giovinazzi, and he was out. And he was out early. and it was also the only retirement from the race. Once Kimi had made contact with Giovinazzi, the wing had actually got itself caught underneath the front of the car. And as he headed into the turn, he just went straight on, and he knew to park it because that was it. That was his race day. So unfortunately for Kimi, not his best performance, certainly his worst performance of the year in my mind. I would rate Kimi Raikkonen's performance this weekend as a 3 out of 10. Qualifying in 14th position was Yuki Tsunoda. This is obviously a disappointing performance for Yuki, being 5 positions behind Pierre and 4.5 tenths off the pace. It's understandable this time. I think he was driving a little bit on the back foot going into this race, considering he crashed out in qualifying in Imola, and then he did get back up into the points, but then a late spin once again relegated him back a few positions, and he ended up finishing in 12th. I think Yuki was trying to have a trouble-free weekend. He was driving a bit defensively, difficult conditions. But overall, I think the AlphaTauri actually looks like one of the most stable cars out of the whole field. It doesn't seem to matter what kind of track it is. It does look stable. Now, I heard Yuki on the team radio after the race say, "Sorry, guys, I just couldn't find any pace." Well, I can tell you what, I know what happened to your first stint. Was the first 3 laps, Yuki, you can't lock up your tires every corner. I mean, he must have been driving on flat spots the whole first stint. It must have been horrible. It might have been for that very reason that he continued to exceed track limits and continued to get warnings before finally getting penalized again. At least he brought the car home in one piece and finished 1 place behind where he qualified, in 15th. I would rate Yuki's performance this weekend as 4 out of 10. Qualifying in 13th position was Fernando Alonso. Alpine brought updates to the Portuguese Grand Prix, and Fernando continues to acclimate himself with the car. Having just proclaimed himself a few weeks ago as still the fastest driver in Formula One, it didn't look very good when Esteban Ocon qualified 6th. Fernando was upfront about his poor driving and qualifying and promised to make amends on race day, which he certainly did. He drove a very solid first stint, and then in the second stint, he started lapping as fast as the leaders. The preseason questions that existed as to whether or not Alonso still had F1 pace, I think his pace at the end of this race answered those questions emphatically. His pace was so good by the end of the race that he was quickly gaining on Ocon, and in fact was the only person who passed Ricciardo while he was charging his way through the field. A very solid result for Alonso, finishing in P8. I will say I noticed one thing, and it was very clear. Fernando's outlook right now is very, very positive, and he was nothing but gracious on the radio after the race. This is a good sign for Alpine. It's a good sign for Fernando, and I rank his performance this weekend as 8 out of 10. Qualifying in 12th position was Antonio Giovinazzi. The pressure on Antonio to perform this year is certainly high. As I've already stated before, he's definitely on one of my hot seats for 2021. And despite that he had to give up his seat for one of the practice sessions, like I said, for Callum Ilott, he managed to out-qualify Kimi pretty handily, and he managed to get on top of a rather difficult car. I think qualifying in 12th position was just about the best that car had in it, and the fact that he finished 12th, solid drive, it's a start. He's outdriven Kimi, which I said he's going to have to do this year if he's going to be taken seriously in 22. So he checked a few boxes this weekend. But again, nothing spectacular from Antonio, but at least it was solid, and I rate his performance as 6 out of 10. Qualifying in 11th position was George Russell. George was obviously looking for a bounce-back week, and he started that off by sharing a plane ride with Toto Wolff and playing backgammon, which he won. I don't think you're supposed to beat the boss, but George managed to beat Toto Wolff in backgammon, and then he was happily going around the paddock, answering the press's questions, wearing his Mercedes shirt. Now, if you haven't had a chance to listen to my Imola Part 2 episode where I go into detail about the accident between George Russell and Valtteri Bottas, please check that out. In that episode, I predict that George Russell has already put ink to paper and has already signed a contract for 2022 for Mercedes. I just found it very interesting that he was wearing the Mercedes shirt, walking around the paddock answering questions to the press about an accident that he had with a Mercedes driver while driving for Williams. You decide. Despite Latifi struggling and qualifying way back in the field in 18th, George's qualification in 11th was very encouraging, and I certainly thought he was going to be looking for some points come race day, especially when you consider he had tire choice. This was all lining up perfectly for Williams and lining up for George to score his first points. Unfortunately, come race day, none of that transpired, and George found himself driving the very same car that Latifi had been describing. In fact, it was so bad, George compared it to the 2019 Williams, and all he did was go backwards. There's no doubt that George got the best out of a bad car come race day, but that didn't stop the fact that he finished 16th. Another opportunity where he was looking at points right in the face, and they just slipped away. I still think after a couple of difficult weeks facing the media about his incident with Bottas, I'm going to be a little easy here on George. I'm going to say that qualifying performance in P11 was pretty special. So I'd rank his performance this race as 7 out of 10. Qualifying in 10th position was Sebastian Vettel. I must admit, when during the practice session when he pulled into the wrong stall, I thought, oh no, this is going to be another one of those weekends. But I was so happy for Seb. Wasn't this great? I mean, we all know that the Aston's not up to it right now. For him to get into Q3 and end up qualifying P10, it's just a huge boost for his morale. And then I looked at the grid and the lineup for the race, and I thought to myself, there's absolutely no way he's going to get any points. Unless there's some attrition or accidents, but he would definitely need to rely on a few safety cars and some luck. But it didn't look like points were in the cards for him, and they weren't. I know that Seb took some criticism for the fact that he openly admitted that Lance had upgrades on his car, almost as if he was trying to justify the difference between the pace between the two drivers during practice and in qualifying. But I think it's fair to say that Sebastian got the most out of that car. And finishing P13, yeah, that's about right for Aston right now. So all in all, I would actually rate this drive quite highly. Well done, Sebastian. Good for you. Hopefully you get to build on this. I rate Sebastian Vettel's performance as 7.5 out of 10. Qualifying in 9th position was Pierre Gasly. No one has gotten less out of a good car this year so far than Pierre. And like I thought, the high rake on the AlphaTauri didn't do them any favors with the high winds in Portugal. He comfortably had the pace over Tsunoda the entire weekend. Yet the best he could do would be finishing 10th, one place higher than he qualified. The good news is he finally scored his first point of the season, and I rate Pierre Gasly's performance as a 7.5 out of 10. Qualifying in 8th position for Scuderia Ferrari, Charles Leclerc. Charles seemed to be struggling with the car throughout practice and was very inconsistent, and it was his teammate Carlos Sainz who was leading the way on the timesheets when compared to each other. Charles said after qualifying that he knew that there was more time in the car and that he was disappointed in his performance. And Charles did what Charles always does, is he brought it come race day. The stroke of luck for him was that he was starting on the medium tire, and the Ferrari proved to be quite good on the hard tire during his second stint. He managed to make up 2 places and finished in 6th, and still was disappointed. He may be the only one who's disappointed with his performance come race day, especially if you're a Ferrari fan, and I would rate his performance quite high. I would rate Charles' performance as an 8.5. Qualifying in 7th position is Lando Norris. It's pretty obvious that Lando is very comfortable in that car, far more comfortable than Daniel, and he's certainly getting the best out of it. Once you get past his infectious laugh and engaging smile, Lando is a serious racer. Going back to last year during the lockdown, I was watching Lando online doing some racing, and I gotta say, having done some online racing myself, he actually is quite clinical about how his driving is. He's very, very analytical and really goes about his business properly. And this weekend, all of a sudden, a name popped in my mind. He started to remind me of Alain Prost. For those of you who got to watch Alain Prost race, I'd be interested in your opinion on that. A young Lando is sort of standing out to me like a young Alain Prost. Lando drove another strong race, his 3rd in succession, and unfortunately he was involved in basically, an exceeding track limits pass on Sergio Perez, and that is what Red Bull is now petitioning. Well, we'll get to that part later, but yeah, Lando made a move on Sergio and then apparently held him up for a while. Other than that, Lando had a wonderful weekend, and he managed to move up 2 positions, finishing 5th. To me, Lando is standing out as one of the young superstars of the year so far, and I would rate his performance this weekend quite highly, especially when you consider his pace against Daniel. I would give Lando Norris a rating of 9 out of 10. Qualifying in 7th position was Esteban Ocon. Esteban, that a boy. This is what I'm talking about. To all those people I placed on the hot seat for 2021, this is what we're talking about. Wow, Esteban. Not many people in Formula One history can say they've outqualified Fernando Alonso by 7 positions. But now you can. And, oh, don't you make things very interesting at Mercedes next year. Wow. Oh, once again, everyone, I need to take a moment because I need to levitate. Awesome job by Esteban Ocon this weekend. Way to go. This kid must be feeling really good about himself. He's had the measure of Alonso. I mean, yeah, Alonso was closing in at the final stages of the races, but who knows if Esteban had things turned down or not. But wow, awesome performance. And this is exactly what he needs. This is exactly what he needs to be taken seriously by Mercedes next year. He did end up losing a position and finishing in 7th. But you know what? I don't think the Alpine was quite that good. I mean, I see Alpine being 9th or 10th, but I don't see them being around 7th. So therefore, I rate his performance quite high. Esteban Ocon, 8.5 out of 10. Qualifying in 5th position for Scuderia Ferrari, Carlos Sainz. If you exclude the rookies, Mazepin, Schumacher, and Tsunoda, there's no question that Carlos Sainz is the one driver who has switched teams and has adapted to his new car the fastest. He looked far more comfortable in the Ferrari this weekend compared to Charles, and he was faster. That was, of course, until race day, when Ferrari yet again have managed to completely bungle their race strategy and their choice of tires. Unfortunately for Carlos, he ended up starting the race on the soft tire and was the first one to pit. And what did Ferrari do? They put him on the mediums. They put him on the mediums until the end of the race. It was painful. It was painful watching Carlos move backwards, where he finally finished 11th. And this week, I would have to say that Carlos Sainz was my biggest disappointment of the race. Not for any fault of his own. I thought his performance was quite strong, and therefore, I would rate Carlos Sainz's performance this weekend as an 8 out of 10. Qualifying in 4th position was Sergio Perez. Really good bounce back for Sergio after a disappointing race in Imola. He seems to be getting a little bit closer, right? A little bit closer to getting used to this car. And he did predict it would take 4 or 5 races. So here we are. Race 3. Sergio's almost there, I think. I admit I have not had a chance to take a look at the race footage where he claimed that Lando was holding him up and basically compromised the rest of his race. But still, qualifying P4, finishing P4 after Imola, I'm going to say this is a positive weekend for Sergio. And it was an excellent drive for him. We saw once again that Sergio was stretching out the life of a set of tires, and Hamilton came up behind him and was asking for blue flags because he didn't realize that actually Sergio was in the lead and hadn't pitted yet. Important to note that Sergio also won Driver of the Day, after apparently Nakita Mazepin was voted by the fans as the Driver of the Day. And the powers that be obviously knew that this was just some sort of an attempt at a poor joke, and they ended up rewarding Sergio with Driver of the Day, so congrats, Sergio. And your performance was definitely better than Mazepin's. And I would give you a rating this weekend of 8 out of 10. Qualifying in 3rd position was Max Verstappen. Max unfortunately had the fastest qualifying lap, but had it erased when he exceeded track limits. It wasn't shown on air, but Max was quite displeased with Sebastian Vettel during qualifying and claimed that he had blocked him. Nevertheless, Max's fast lap was disqualified, and this was his first mistake of the weekend. Despite driving a faultless race, Max was unable to claim victory in Portugal. And this has to be a worrying thing for Red Bull. As we all saw in preseason testing, the Mercedes was nowhere near the Red Bull's pace. But we also knew that Mercedes, with its vast resources, would be able to get back up to pace after a few races. This made the opening races of the 2021 season that much more important. And so far, Red Bull aren't delivering. In an earlier podcast, I made mention of the fact that Red Bull were certainly walking around during preseason testing with an air of confidence. And now, I see that already disappearing. It can be easily argued that Portimao did not suit the Red Bull. But the fact is, Max was fastest in qualifying before that lap was deleted. And therefore, Red Bull have had the fastest car the first 3 races of this season, yet they've only won once. As a team, they're still struggling to get Sergio up to pace, and that's why this time is critical for Max to score as many points as possible, not only for himself, but for the team and the Constructors' Championship. As the race progressed, it was easy to see that Max definitely had the better of Valtteri. Now the one question remained, would he have enough to fend off Lewis? And that question would be answered when Lewis, late in the race, not only passed Max, but drove off into the distance. I can't help but think that Red Bull have squandered and missed a serious opportunity here to dominate the early part of this season. And it's my prediction that it will be these races that come back to haunt them at the end. The order was Sir Lewis, Max Verstappen, and Valtteri Bottas. And this is when Mercedes tried to make the best of a bad situation for Valtteri and pitted him near the end of the race for the fastest lap. Shortly thereafter, Red Bull did the same for Max. And in classic Red Bull fashion, when they needed a fast pit stop, they delivered. Sub 2.0, 1.9 was the stop. When you compare that to Mercedes' pit stop so far this season, there's a huge difference. It's almost a second every time they come into the pits, and that's massive. They managed to get Max back out on the track with a fresh set of boots, and on this attempt, he did set fastest lap, but like qualifying, had exceeded track limits and had his lap negated, thus giving the fastest lap of the race back to Valtteri. This was Max's second mistake of the weekend. Despite a heroic drive in difficult conditions with the highest of pressures, Verstappen did move up a spot and finished in P2, but I can't help but feel that this is still a disappointment. It must be said. Not winning a race when you have the fastest car is a big mistake. And this was the third mistake of the weekend for Red Bull and Max. Preseason testing in Bahrain wasn't that long ago, but the looks on the Red Bull faces have already changed. Max left saying he never wanted to return to this circuit, and Red Bull filed an official complaint against the FIA about their practices and policing of track limits. Finishing second is still a great accomplishment. And despite all that went on this weekend, I still rate Max Verstappen's drive very highly and give him a 9 out of 10. Qualifying in second position was Sir Lewis Hamilton. Going into the race, it was speculated in the press that Lewis was actually looking forward to re-signing with Mercedes for 2022 going forwards. Not known as someone who enjoys testing, he actually took part in the Pirelli 2022 tire test a few weeks ago and said he was looking forward to helping Pirelli develop a better product. That doesn't sound to me like a guy who's about to retire. In fact, I wouldn't be surprised at all if we hear in the coming months that Lewis has extended his contract for 2022 with Mercedes. And if my prediction that George Russell has already put ink to paper for Mercedes in 2022, perhaps that may add some credibility to my theory that Bottas' move on Russell in Imola was intentional. I'll let you decide. It certainly looks to me like Lewis is embracing this new challenge, that for the first time in a long time, he's not just fighting his own teammate. I think Lewis is taking personal joy in being the difference maker, because ever since day one of this season, the Mercedes has never been considered faster than the Red Bull. Yet, Sir Lewis and Mercedes have won 2 races. And it was Sir Lewis who took the battle to Max and Red Bull in Portimao. Once again, Valtteri Bottas could not answer that call. Sir Lewis did. His pace in Q2 on the medium tire was simply stunning, and his pace on the hard tire in the race was even better. The only real hiccup for Lewis was on the restart, when he misjudged what Valtteri was doing and got caught by Max. But to watch Lewis work his way through the graining phase of those tires during this race was an absolute masterclass. An absolute masterclass. And that's the difference between him and Valtteri Bottas when it came to this race, was simply how did they treat their tires. And having watched in-car camera of both of them driving during qualifying and in practice, Valtteri's driving style is definitely different, and he's handling an understeer condition completely different than Lewis with the use of his brakes. Lewis just minded his own business, kept out of trouble, got through the graining phase, kept those tires in the right temperature window, and then just drove right round both of them. Make no mistake about it. Lewis has been the difference in the first 3 races. He knows it. Toto knows it. Valtteri knows it. Max knows it. Red Bull knows it. Christian's not smiling very much, is he? I actually saw an interesting stat today. That Lewis Hamilton now has more wins than Fernando Alonso, Sebastian Vettel, and Max Verstappen combined. There's no doubting he's special, folks. There's no doubting it. And we're watching the evolution of one of the greats. His performance this weekend earned him a rating of 10 out of 10. Qualifying in pole position, Valtteri Bottas, 5.0. After a disappointing performance in Imola, Valtteri apparently spent the weeks leading up to this Grand Prix in the Mercedes simulator. No doubt you can tell he's not as comfortable with this year's car as Lewis is. His work in the simulator seemed to pay off, as he showed up and was immediately on Lewis's pace. And after difficult, windy conditions in qualifying, it was Valtteri who denied Lewis Hamilton his 100th pole. He even managed to trick Lewis on the restart, and all looked like it was going well from the outside. But again, if you were to watch Valtteri's in-car camera, you could definitely see why he was running into graining issues with his tires. His lead proved to be short-lived, as he was overtaken by Max and Lewis. And that's the problem. Mercedes don't mind if you lose to Lewis, but they don't want you losing to Max. And unfortunately for Valtteri, this happens more than not. Now, we'll give Valtteri the benefit of the doubt this weekend. In my eyes, it was a decent bounce back after a poor performance in Imola. He had good pace in practice. He had great pace in qualifying, securing the pole. He led the race. He raced Lewis and Max cleanly. And at the end of the day, he learned a very, very important thing. Max and Lewis are better than him. That's a hard thing to take for a professional race car driver, especially at that level. He did finish the race in P3, like I said, and he had the fastest lap. So on paper, a good weekend. In his heart, he was beaten by Max and Sir Lewis, and I rate his performance this weekend as 8 out of 10. It will be interesting to see how Valtteri recovers from this. Will he be heading back to the simulator, diving back into the data, manically searching for the difference between himself and Lewis? Or is it time to just have a nice cup of coffee and take a plane ride with Toto and play some backgammon? Oh, I forgot. George is. I hope you enjoyed this podcast. My name is Matthew Kane. If you don't already follow me on social media, please do. I am dirty_F1 on Twitter and the Dirtier F1 podcast on both YouTube and on Instagram. Thank you so much for spending a part of your day with me. I really appreciate it. And I look forward to talking to you again in a couple of days after the race in Spain. Until then, take care, and I'll talk to you soon.
What a phenomenal race by Lewis. And I'm a bit amused because Max Verstappen is starting to understand better and better how good Lewis Hamilton is. And he needs to do everything perfect to beat him in the championship. And at the moment, it's 2-1 for Lewis.